ready to go.
Yeah.
It's just past midday, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining to today's event. I'm John Armitt, the chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, and it's very good to be speaking to you today to launch our Infrastructure Progress Review, the Commission's 5th annual monitoring report. Joining me today at our offices in London is James Heath, our chief executive, and I know a number of our fellow commissioners are on the line from around the country. Before I introduce the report, just a few housekeeping notices. The event will be recorded, and by joining, you give your agreement to being captured on film if you decide to switch your camera on at any point. I'm pleased to welcome a number of journalists to the call today as well, so you should assume that you are speaking on record if you do make any contributions. You will find you have automatically been muted to avoid any audio interference. After our presentations, we will invite you to use the Teams function to raise your hand so that we can see that you have a question to pose, and we will then unmute you so that we can hear your question directly. So let me now turn to the conclusions of our annual review. Its purpose is to consider the extent to which government is making progress on implementing recommendations made by the Commission, which ministers have subsequently endorsed as policy. It's worth remembering that the vast majority of our recommendations are accepted by government, currently around 80%. But that is, of course, only the first step. The really hard part is to take the necessary steps to turn that policy intent into policy action and delivery. The National Infrastructure Strategy, published in November 2020, formed government's official response to our first major assessment report, which we produced in 2018. Last year, we paid due credit to the government for drawing together this comprehensive strategy with clear long-term goals, particularly in the midst of the COVID pandemic, I should say. And this year, we recognise the commitment confirmed in last autumn's spending review for £100 billion to be spent on infrastructure over the next 3 years. Government also announced it would increase the Commission's fiscal remit, the funding envelope within which the Commission must cost our recommendations, to 1.1 to 1.3% of GDP per year from 2025 out to 2055. The challenge, of course, is getting that money out of the door, converting a commitment into effective and efficient spending, which truly helps prepare our transport, energy, flood resilience, water, waste, and digital networks for the future. So we have a plan. Formed extensively by the work of our independent commission, we have at least initial funding for it, and we have some early steps towards implementing it. Today's report acknowledges progress in some areas, notably the expansion of gigabit-capable broadband networks and the growth in capacity of renewable electricity generation. James will say a bit more about the detail of each of the sectors within our remit in a few moments. But, as I write in my foreword to the report, it is also our role as independent advisors to sound a warning when we think that progress is insufficient towards key objectives. It bears repetition that the goals of cutting greenhouse gas emissions, improving resilience to climate change, and spreading economic opportunity more evenly across the country are all objectives around which there is a remarkable level of political and public consensus. And if we're to achieve these common goals against the ambitious timescales to which government has committed itself, sometimes in the form of legislation, then it's important to be clear when progress towards them is not fast enough. And in our judgment, that is the current position. Since the National Infrastructure Strategy, some of the strategies that government has developed over the last year lack detailed policy plans, leave key gaps, or do not go far enough. And urgent steps need to be taken to address this. Today's report highlights several areas of particular concern. This chart shows that the heavy lifting in cutting emissions has been undertaken so far by changes to power generation behind the plug, but much less progress has been made on decarbonising heating, probably the biggest infrastructure challenge that we face to hit net zero. To attack the dark blue chunk by 2035, we need a detailed and funded delivery plan to support the targets in the heat and building strategy. Government's current approach relies heavily on the cost of heat pumps and hydrogen falling rapidly. In 2020, around 36,000 heat pumps were installed, and even if that increased last year, it remains far short of the government's target for 600,000 a year by 2028. Based on current plans, it's hard to see how this will be delivered if the cost of heat pumps does not fall in line with government's stretching ambitions. The government did not agree with our recommendation to target 21,000 energy-efficient installations per week, preferring instead a target to upgrade as many homes as possible to a rating of Energy Performance Certificate EPC Band C by 2035. Ministers have allocated funding to improve energy efficiency in social housing and low-income households, and are using regulations to support improvements in the private rented sector. But there remains little incentive to encourage any energy efficiency measures by owner-occupiers. Owner-occupiers make up a large proportion of the housing stock, and so this is a big problem. The need to meet the sixth carbon budget means that resolving these challenges is now urgent. Another example is flood resilience. The recent IPCC report on an adaptation further brought home, as if we needed it, the urgent need to act to better prepare ourselves for a changing climate. While government has committed significant funding for flood resilience, we remain concerned prioritisation of spending is not supported by any clear long-term objective for flood resilience. We know that a policy document on flood resilience indicators is due this year, but it is vital that government moves quickly to set out publicly what it wants to achieve in the long term. The third example, before I turn to James, is electric vehicle charge points. The Commission has long advocated for the importance of a visible, comprehensive network to give drivers the confidence to switch to electric vehicles. The first assessment focused on the need for a national network of rapid chargers, and more recently attention has focused on local on-street provision and ensuring that any barriers to their installation are removed. Both are needed. As this graph shows, the current rate of deployment needs to accelerate considerably to end the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. The market should ramp up numbers in response to growing demand as long as the right conditions are in place. We need a strategy to turbocharge the rollout to ensure that the whole country has coverage, while also ensuring that those without garages or driveways can safely charge their vehicles at an efficient time of day. I appreciate this is not a new call, but people have to start seeing those black columns springing up from their streets in much greater numbers and fast. In itemising some of these areas for action, we are of course conscious of the wider pressures on government and indeed on households around the UK right now. But ensuring that policy and delivery plans are in place and that they are being activated on the ground is the only way to address the stubbornly difficult problems that will not become any easier or cheaper to solve by delaying action. We will continue to monitor progress across the portfolio of accepted recommendations alongside our current work on the next National Infrastructure Assessment, which will be published next autumn. And I hope that this time next year, we will be able to report tangible progress on some of the areas we've highlighted today, remembering that the quicker we get to grips with these challenges, the quicker that society and our environment will reap the benefits. I'll now hand over to James.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll now briefly run through the 6 infrastructure sectors in our remit and the extent to which the key recommendations made by the Commission are on track. We've used 5 tests to conduct this exercise for each recommendation area. And those 5 tests are: does the government have a long-term perspective? Does it have clear goals and plans to achieve them? Does it have a firm funding commitment? Does it have a genuine commitment to change? And the 5th test is whether we are seeing action on the ground. And as you can see on the chart that's currently on screen, we give an overall assessment, a RAG-rated overall assessment of where we think government is on each of the key recommendation areas. And in those areas where we think insufficient progress has been made, today's report suggests priority actions that government should consider taking in order to get back on track. So I will now sort of unpack each recommendation area, starting with energy. So first, electricity generation. In 2020, renewable electricity generation made up 43% of total electricity supply, an increase of around 6 percentage points on the previous year. We know 2021 was slightly lower, but that's only due to it being sort of less windy rather than a changing underlying infrastructure. Government has an effective policy in place to continue this progress over the next decade. However, a significant challenge remains to meet the government's ambition of a sort of net zero electricity system by 2035 while maintaining security of supply. And as we all know, events in Ukraine have only underlined the importance of reducing our reliance on gas. Second area is heat. As John referenced, decarbonising heat is a sort of different sort of challenge. While decarbonising power generation is something that can be to a degree achieved by central coordination and planning with a relatively small number of actors involved, decarbonising heating is a distributed challenge that will directly affect over 2 million homes in the UK. The government's heat strategy sets out some long-term targets in this space, but there are some key unresolved issues that need to be addressed, including what heating technologies are feasible and where, how much investment is required and who will pay for this, and how will the transition be incentivised and delivered at pace. As an immediate priority for this year, we must see an improved set of energy efficiency schemes to put the country on track to deliver the government's target for as many homes as possible to be EPC Band C rated or above by 2035. And the final energy area where we've made recent recommendations to government is the subject of engineered greenhouse gas removals that are vital for the UK to deliver on its climate targets. Here, we think government should ensure that the first engineered removal plants are up and running no later than 2030, and it should publish detailed plans to deliver 5 to 10 metric tons of CO2 of removals per year, as it is indicated in its net zero strategy. Now, shifting to the digital sector. Here, delivery of gigabit-capable broadband networks, as John referenced, is sort of progressing rapidly. And at the end of 2021, gigabit-capable coverage extended to around 65% of UK premises. If operators deliver on their published plans, government will very likely achieve its target to deliver 85% gigabit coverage by 2025. But across both gigabit broadband and also 4G networks, government must ensure that areas at hard to reach do not get left behind, including through its major public subsidy programme on gigabit and work on the shared rural network on mobile. As far as 5G is concerned, we're seeing good progress on network rollout in urban areas, being driven by sort of network competition, but there does remain a critical question about the strategic and public value that 5G will provide beyond being just faster 4G. So as a priority this year, we think that government should set out an assessment of the country's future wireless connectivity needs and how mobile networks will need to evolve to meet this future demand, and look at what the respective roles are for the market, for government and the regulator. So turning to waste next. Our assessment here is that more action is needed to deliver a low carbon waste sector at an affordable cost. Following an increase between 2000 and 2010, municipal waste recycling rates have plateaued over the last decade at just above 40%. Meanwhile, plastic packaging rates have increased significantly, though they appear to have stabilised in the last year, which of course may have some link to COVID. Both types of recycling will need to increase considerably. In the case of municipal recycling, government has set an ambitious target of 65% by 2035. And if we're going to get anywhere near reaching that target, we've quickly got to finalise policy on key areas such as extended producer responsibility, deposit return schemes, recycling consistency, and bans on certain types of plastics that could all help achieve the ambitious targets that have been set on that timeframe. Government has also demonstrated a commitment to reducing emissions from food waste, supported by a clear funding commitment to separately collect food waste and divert it into anaerobic digestion for biogas production, clear plans should now be delivered to ensure all local authorities achieve this separate collection by 2025. Now turning to water. Water quantity is as big a challenge as water quality, and additional water capacity is going to be needed to avert the real and growing risk of water shortages in certain parts of the UK. We're seeing that government-regulated industry are making progress on reducing leakage and on developing new supply infrastructure, but per capita water consumption, already at unsustainable levels, is not yet falling. There are ambitious targets for reducing per person water consumption, but it is not yet clear in our view whether the government's new policies will deliver the reductions that are needed. So as a priority for this year, our view is that government industry must strengthen and progress plans for reducing per capita water consumption to deliver the targeted 110 litres per person per day by 2050. Next area is flood resilience. Here, what we're seeing is that government investment in flood defences has doubled, and policies have been revised to emphasise catchment-based planning, green infrastructure and property level resilience. But as we've seen in recent months, the flooding problem is not going away, and it is not realistic to build our way out of climate change or to stop all floods. But what we do need to have is a sort of set of clear resilience objectives for the long term that give a sense of the destination the government's trying to achieve and ensure we have the systems in place to respond and recover effectively to those floods that do occur. As John said, we think a priority for this year is for government to set out those long-term measurable objectives for what flood resilience in England is trying to achieve. Next, I'll cover transport. On interurban transport, clearly the biggest development over the last 12 months has been the publication of the government's integrated rail plan, which sets out a long-term plan for rail in the North and the Midlands, combining new high-speed lines with upgrading and electrifying existing lines. We think it's sensible that this plan takes an adaptive approach and setting out a core pipeline of investments that should speed up delivery of the benefits. The government has also published its Levelling Up White Paper, and this sets out some ambitious goals on local transport. Our view is that these goals need to be matched by an equally ambitious policy reform and implementation programme if we are to achieve tangible change by 2030, as the Levelling Up White Paper sets out. We've picked out three particular areas where we think government should prioritise progress. The first is on developing a pipeline of mass transit systems for urban centres outside London, building on the commitment that was made in the integrated rail plan for a new mass transit system for West Yorkshire. The second priority is to shift away from the competitive bidding between councils for multiple short-term funding pots in transport and move to long-term devolved funding settlements. And the white paper has promised to look at streamlining local growth funding, which is positive. We now need to see that promise turned into real change quickly. And the third area I think government should prioritise to take forward the Levelling Up White Paper is the sort of accelerating the planned new devolution deals for all local areas in London that come forward. We think this should be done quicker than 2030. On freight, we think here that progress has been made in terms of setting targets for decarbonising freight. However, a detailed analysis of the infrastructure requirements for transitioning to zero carbon freight is still needed, and we hope this is set out in the government's upcoming Future of Freight strategy. And as John has noted, on the rollout of electric charge points, the progress is too slow. Analysis suggests that by 2030, between 280,000 and 480,000 charge points will be needed to facilitate the transition to electric vehicles. There are currently around 28,000 public charge points in the country. Around 5,000 of these are rapid chargers, and of the remainder, only around 1,000 of these are on street charge points outside of London. Currently, over 80 million households do not have access to a drive or garage to install a charge point, and this will require access to locally available public charge points. So we need to see significantly more charge points, both a comprehensive network of rapid charge points and also a comprehensive network of on-street slower charge points if we're going to give drivers a confidence to switch en masse and at a fast pace to electric vehicles. I'll now end with some sort of cross-cutting themes that the Commission has made recommendations to government on. First, on resilience. And here, government has broadly accepted our recommendations on the need for clear, transparent and regularly updated resilience standards for infrastructure. And it's also accepted the need for stress testing to ensure these standards can be met. We think the real test of government's ambition in this area will be whether the forthcoming National Resilience Strategy includes the detailed plans that are required to make improvements in this area. And finally, on economic regulation, the government's recent policy paper shows that it understands the need to modernise our system of independent economic regulation in order to respond to the new challenges of both net zero and climate adaptation. As part of this, government is conducting a review of regulators' duties, and the report we published today reiterates the Commission's recommendation that government should legislate for net zero and resilience duties for Ofwat and Ofgem. I will stop there, and John and myself are very happy to take questions. Just to reiterate the process, if you could raise your hands using the yellow hand function on Teams or singly in the chat, either of those two routes I'll try and pick up and then I'll unmute you. But while you're thinking of questions, we have had some questions submitted in advance, and I will read out one of those to get us going. So this question was submitted by Dan Barrett from Traverse, and Dan asks, what impact do you feel the Levelling Up white paper will have on the infrastructure sector, and what contribution do you feel infrastructure can have in achieving the wider aims of the white paper outside of those directly related to infrastructure? And I will turn to John for an answer on this one.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Well, obviously the white paper was something which everybody had been waiting for. And what it has done is clarified the government's broad approach, and it sets out some pretty ambitious goals to be delivered in just the next 8 years. But that's a pretty short period of time. And if you're going to force the economic shifts which are going to be required, then it's difficult to see that taking place through central government. And that's why we feel that local leaders are going to have to be empowered to develop their own tailor-made solutions to their particular area. Our report today sets out 3 specific areas which we've referred to that we think government should prioritise and that James has just covered. A pipeline of mass transit projects for urban centres outside of London, but fundamental reform for local transport funding, which is allocated locally on a consistent and continuous basis. Let's accelerate the planned new devolution deals for local areas in England, which have got to be in place much sooner than the government's objective of 2030. If we don't actually have any devolution of the ability of local authorities to proceed, then and that's going to take until 2030, then it's difficult to see how we're going to make a lot of progress in the infrastructure impact on levelling up in that period. Now, infrastructure does have a significant part to play, but it's not the only way in which you can achieve levelling up. And obviously, education and training are equally important, and training for skilled jobs. And we've already referenced today the need for a major uptake in both the installation of EV charge points, but also, of course, the efficiency of our homes. You need to remember that 85% of the homes in the UK at the moment are heated by gas. Now, that's all going to have to change. So there's going to have to be a massive change in the way in which we heat our homes and indeed in the thermal efficiency of our homes. So the insulation programme is going to be massive. That's a great opportunity for local jobs, an opportunity right across the country. So it's not something which just happens in London and the South East, but it's just as important across the rest of the country.
Thanks, John. I'll now turn to guests who have submitted questions. I'll kick off with Olivia.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Lovely. Great. Thank you so much. My question's about the electric vehicle charger rollout and some of your warnings around that. I wondered if you could spell out, what's the risk to that 2030 deadline to phasing out new petrol and diesel cars, if the government doesn't do what you suggest and really speed up that process? And secondly, do you think that target currently looks realistic based on what we know about the number of chargers that there are and how fast that process is going? Thank you.
I think to your, in a sense, what's behind your question, Olivia, there must be a real risk. If we want to actually be in a position where new car sales in petrol and diesel are going to cease in 2030, then that means that an enormous number of cars will have to have converted before then. And if they're not going to convert, if they don't know that they can get a charge. And so it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. We all, I suspect, on this call we'll all ask ourselves this question, and we'll all sit back, in a sense, waiting to be confident that those charge points are in place. And if they're not in place, then it's a brave person who says, well, I'll just take a chance and I'll buy an EV. It's particularly difficult for people who don't have the opportunity to charge in their own garage or on their own driveway. And if you're parking your car on the street, then that becomes a particular challenge. And so you're going to be reliant on those street ones, the ones which are in supermarket car parks, general public car parks, and at petrol stations, service stations. So I think it's just got to increase significantly. And as we said originally, the key to this was a concerted action between the government, the regulator, who's got to actually help the energy companies to put the distribution networks and reinforce them for the charging, and the companies who are going to provide these opportunities. I think we've seen in the digital world how when regulator, government, and companies work together, you get success. EV charge points could be another example.
Thank you, John. I'll move on to Andy Walker next.
Sorry, I've just unmuted. I thought you were going to do that for me. Andy Walker from Infrastructure Intelligence. Two very quick questions. Firstly, there's a lot of chatter at the moment, post everything that's happening in the Ukraine, about I sense that people are looking to move away from net zero. There's been some conversation in government around whether or not that's feasible going forward. So I'd be interested in Sir John's views around that and the current effects of what's happening internationally. And secondly, I was particularly struck by what you said around needing to speed up devolution, because for me that seems to be going very slowly, and you've basically earmarked that in your opening remarks in the executive summary. You said that things needed to happen a lot quicker. Are you confident that the devolution agenda is going to continue at pace or move at sufficient pace in order to make progress on these infrastructure plans?
Thanks, Andy.
Okay, Andy. Well, on net zero, I mean, the net zero target, of course, is 2050. And indeed, the decarbonisation of electricity is 2035. The Ukraine situation is clearly fundamentally affecting the price of our energy today. But in terms of the nature of our electricity generation and our decarbonisation going forward, that is a long-term issue. That's a long-term subject, and therefore, I would hope that over the next, as things settle down, and hopefully they are going to settle down fairly quickly in the Ukraine, we'll see a return to the more normal thinking about what is the best way to decarbonize, get to net zero, which is very much about renewable energy, of course, and therefore I don't think we need to be, and if you'll excuse the pun, blown off course by what's happening in the delivery of renewable energy going forward. And we shouldn't rush into just sort of making short-term decisions in the belief that the Ukraine is changing everything for the next 30 years. And that's a challenge for government, which is clearly wanting to show and see that it's taking action. But any of these other alternatives which are being discussed, whether it's more nuclear, whether it's fracking, anything like that, is not going to change the situation in the short term. So our debates about energy security will continue, I think, in the way that we've conducted them before, and the issues remain the same as they have before. In terms of devolution, well, I'm afraid, no, I'm not overly optimistic. We have a statement of good intent, but statements of good intent don't actually put breakfast on the table. And, you know, therefore, what we need to see is real determination by government to devolve, and to say that it hopes to have got authorities in a devolution place by 2030. Well, if that's the case, they're not going to be able to do very much before 2030. So I think we've got to move much more quickly. And whatever our government is, they've always been reluctant to do this in the last 20 years, and therefore it's going to need a significant change of heart if we're going to achieve any serious devolution.
Thanks, John. I'll invite Chris Smythe to ask a question next.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think just on a similar point, you expressed concern about slow progress on net zero, but the Prime Minister has, just promised a new energy strategy to reduce our dependence on Russian oil and gas, and said specifically that he wants to extract more of UK hydrocarbons. So how much is there a trade-off, do you think, either short or long term, between net zero and energy security? And would increasing UK production now actually make any meaningful difference to the prices for UK consumers?
Well, Chris, the first thing to say is you can't just increase UK supply. It requires the companies to create their own delivery plan, their own upgrading of their current circumstances. It requires them to invest, and therefore you're not going to see an ability to just turn a tap and suddenly increase what's taking place in the UK. Everybody accepts that fracking is not something which is going to create any quick an easy answer, and even if it were to go ahead, it will go ahead after all sorts of planning issues and other issues. So I don't really personally believe that's going to be any sort of significant, make any significant difference. Nuclear, we did a study for government recently, and in which our opinion was, even if you ordered another nuclear power station tomorrow, you're unlikely to see it before 2035, the earliest. So that's not going to make an immediate impact. So as I've just said, I think we have to stick to a considered long-term perspective if you want to take yourself off gas. And we've got to get off gas, both for two reasons. One, to reduce our reliance on it from outside of the UK, but secondly, to get ourselves down to net zero. So one way or another, we've got to get off gas. So the real question is, what are we going to do to get off gas? And that, of course, in the domestic sense, we've talked about in regard to heat pumps and potentially hydrogen, although hydrogen is still in the sort of the question mark area at the moment, potentially more likely for some forms of transport and potentially for heavy industry. But how do we get ourselves off gas? And that has got to be more renewables, whether it's onshore wind, offshore wind. Solar is probably the quickest way in which you can get an increase in your renewables. So, yep, the Ukraine is a tragedy. It's creating a series of price hikes at the moment. But in terms of our long-term requirements for our energy sources and how we go about it, I don't think it's changed the fundamentals that much.
What about North Sea? I mean, the Prime Minister talks specifically about new licenses there. Is that feasible or counterproductive?
Well, it's clearly feasible, but all you're doing is making life more difficult to get to net zero. So yes, we can introduce new licenses. You can ask the private sector to, in a sense, going almost into reverse gear from where their investment has been heading, which is towards renewables, and say, well, okay, we want you to now allocate some of your investments into upgrading what's going on in the North Sea. That's not something which happens overnight. It'll take time. If you want to open up some of your storage facilities which are being closed down, that takes time and it costs money. So yes, it's an option, but it doesn't address the long-term problem.
Thanks, Chris. I'll now call Dave Merritt for a question.
Transport delivery is local. different mayoral and local authorities have been looking at how they might address the decarbonisation of transport challenge, and particularly the shorter run targets. It's clear that electrification of road vehicles isn't going to happen fast enough. And different authorities are coming up with different approaches as to how they deal with it. And some, when they actually realise the scale of the challenge, are frankly hiding from it. I wondered how you felt that the issues should be tackled in terms of, government guidance, your own inputs and so on. Thank you.
No, it's a good question, Dave. And one of the issues that we've identified, of course, is the degree of resource, the degree of skill and knowledge that any local authority has when it's starting to pick up the ball on these issues. And it's not going to be able to attract the right skills without some sort of long-term program. So that's the first question of government support. Is this just a sort of short-term, or is it something longer-term, which enables local authorities to recruit and to be able to get the right people to help them prepare these plans? We have actually suggested that a body at the centre would be useful, which could actually provide local authorities with help and guidance and best practice and helping them to generate their strategies. We did a little bit of this ourselves a few years ago with various local authorities and looking at long-term infrastructure strategy. So, and of course, they will be different. Local people will always have their different agendas. Some will go faster than others. Some of those who go fastest might have make some mistakes, which other people can then learn from subsequently. But the key thing is that none of it's going to happen without that devolution of authority, a long-term perspective, which says this isn't a flash in the pan. This is something which is going to be serious for the long term, which enables people to generate the skills and knowledge to take forward the programs and plans that they are right for their local area.
Yeah, Dave, I'd just add a point to that. How important local authorities' role will be in solving the EV charging infrastructure problem, or at least a problem which is about a comprehensive network of on-street slow chargers. The local authorities are sort of the gatekeepers to that infrastructure, if you like, and therefore their role will be really, really important.
Tried that many times, it didn't work.
Dave, are you coming back in? No, I'll just first point. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of solving this electric vehicle question, because without the large-scale adoption, it's difficult to see how we get to decarbonisation. The volume of car usage is just so great that the idea you're going to solve it through mode shift will play a part, but without the rollout of infrastructure and the mass-scale usage of electric vehicles, you are not going to solve the decarbonisation of surface transport problem. So it is absolutely fundamental. Anyway, I will bring in Paul Spence next.
Thank you, John and James, for the report and the scorecard. I guess my first takeaway is that you're much more positive on national ambition than on national delivery, and it's nice that you are recognising the progress in electricity. But I do wonder whether or not actually there's a little bit more that we could be doing to accelerate on, as you say, John, solar. I would argue decisions on nuclear now, because if we want delivery in the 2030s, we need to take decisions now on that. But I guess one area where perhaps we could be doing more and sooner is around energy efficiency. We've seen a doubling in the incentives for energy efficiency with the price hike from the Ukraine. We have the prospect that might be up to a trebling, which fundamentally changes the calculus. And I wonder whether, as a commission, you've looked at what it would take to massively accelerate the delivery before, even before next winter. I know it's not all of your time frame, but I think that piece around delivery of efficiency measures as the first step to decarbonise heating is something that perhaps we should be emphasising more.
Well, I don't disagree at all, Paul, that it needs to be re-emphasised. I think the challenge, of course, is that if on the one hand we are having to people are having to spend more for their electricity, and that's a monthly bill, and the money's going out the door on a monthly basis, to then say, oh, and by the way, I'm also going to set aside another few hundred a month, or I'm going to take out my longer mortgage, or I'm going to somehow find £10,000 to improve the insulation of my property. It isn't going to happen, because people will spend what they can afford. And therefore, without some really strong government incentive and initiative here, I just don't see it happening at the pace that is required. Now, we can, no doubt everybody on the call might have a view about what those incentives might be and how they're delivered. But it is going to require something much, much bigger than what is currently being proposed. I mean, as has already been said by the CCC, well, part of the problem is offering somebody £5,000 towards their heat pump. That £5,000 will probably be taken, thank you very much, by the people who are already going to install one anyway. And so it's small beer and it's short term. It's like so many of these challenges that we face, where we've seen in the UK to have multiple answers to a single question. And you can select one of 10 ways in which you might get some money. It just makes it complicated. It needs to be simplified, and it needs to be very significant if we're going to make any impact on this at all. We're talking about probably, I mean, the CCC has said that it thinks that there are 10 million homes at the moment which could actually take a heat pump. They're reasonably efficient. We've got 28 million homes. That leaves 18 million homes requiring attention. It's a massive challenge, and it's a massive opportunity to reduce our carbon, but it's also, I think, a massive jobs opportunity.
Absolutely, completely agree.
I'll call on Mike next, just his question.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the report. The question relates to the waste element of the report, and obviously the circular economy has a big part to play in, helping to achieve net zero. My question is around recycling being, if you like, the bottom rung of the circular economy. I'm really thinking about integrating some of the stuff above it. So talking about how do we encourage better reuse, extended producer responsibility maybe for everything or as much as possible, looking at how that fits in with reuse and remanufacturing and the potential for hubs and reverse logistics.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Look, I mean, this is an area that we are going to look at in more detail as part of the next National Infrastructure Assessment. And you're right, there's some upstream questions around how you design products. There's some downstream questions about waste infrastructure, recycling rates, energy for waste, which we'll probably focus on, given we're the National Infrastructure Commission. There's then this bit in the middle about reuse and repair ideas, which I think we will take a look at how important they are and how big they are compared to both the upstream design and the downstream infrastructure. I think we are not clear on at the moment, but it is an area that we're going to look at, because it's clear in the waste space, looking at the data, there's quite a lot going on. The waste is still increasing, recycling rates have plateaued, emissions from waste are going up. How you actually design waste infrastructure to reduce impact on the economy and deliver net zero at an affordable cost is actually quite an interesting and significant challenge. I think it's one that we probably need to spend a bit more attention on in the next NIA. Some fascinating issues there. If you want anything to add, John?
No, I mean, obviously, I think there's always a bit of a two-edged sword around waste from heat. Heat from waste, of course, where there's been a move away from, or a desire to move away from incineration. But I mean, it's an obvious one that, in a sense, if you're looking to find different ways of generating your heat, then incinerating your heat in a way, incinerating your waste in a way which is clean is a technical challenge, but one which I think, again, is still worth looking at, particularly as we move towards potentially more use of district heating systems. So whether it's bioenergy or whether it's heat from waste. The other thing, which of course has been talked about in the past, is the fact that across the country we have multiple different ways in which waste is collected. We don't have a single standard approach across the country, which seems to be an easy win to actually get everybody on the same page, understanding the best way in which waste can be collected. We don't yet have food waste being collected separately across the country in the way that they do in Wales, for example. So I think it's a mixture of big things and small things, and finding the right incentives for people to actually want to minimize their waste in the way they go about their lives. There's opportunities there in terms of public agendas and public messaging and so forth.
Thanks, John. I might bring Bridget Rosewell in, one of our fellow commissioners, for a comment.
Yes, thanks, James. I think the other part of this that we will be looking at from the point of view of the next infrastructure assessment is also very much around the provision of infrastructure. After all, we're seeing a lot of pushback against new infrastructure being not sufficiently zero carbon. And so I think we'll be looking at, say, things like low carbon concrete, steel, all of those sorts of aspects is going to be very important as we think about the most effective use of infrastructure that we've got, which is something we've already looked at, but also when we do need new infrastructure, how do we provide that in the most effective way possible? Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. I'll go to Mark next for a question. Mark Frost.
Thank you.
Still on...
Hopefully you
can hear you now, Mark. Yep.
Brilliant. I mean, first of all, just want to say thank you so much for all the work you're doing on moving this discussion around a long-term devolved funding settlement for local authorities. As being one of those officers who spent hundreds of hours on unsuccessful competitions over my career to date, which had led no benefit whatsoever to residents of the areas I've worked. I mean, that is so vital, and you're really flying the flag on that. So just thank you so much for that. My question is about maybe some of the unintended and downstream consequences of the electrification of surface transport, and just want to pick out two possible issues. Be interested in your views. So one, it's really important that we get lots of charging points in there. Clearly that's key, but there's a massive price differential between people who can charge in their garage and in their driveway and those that have to access it via public sources. It can be 5, 6, 7 times, and that is only going to be exacerbated as vehicle to grid technology increases. And to a certain extent, you can fill up your car for free if you happen to have a windy evening. That has big equity issues, and essentially the cost of fuel is going to be linked to housing tenure, which is really not a very palatable prospect at all. So I'd just be interested in your Infrastructure Commission's view on what we can do to deal with that. And then as a sort of related point, I guess, electric fuel is very cheap, even if you're fueling up in public charging point. That leads to induced demand, which means more mileage, and that has strains on infrastructure. What tools and technique, has there been any sort of assessment or thoughts from you on managing that, and what tools and techniques might be appropriate? And given I'm chair of the Transport Planning Society, you might see I'm fishing around road user charging there a little bit.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I just wrote down congestion charging is road charging, whatever you call it, but there are different ways of charging, as you say, for access to roads, and clearly that will be a potential tool for influencing the degree to which we give up the car and degree to which we use public transport. And of course, the age-old thing about public transport is we use it when it's reliable and affordable. And we know that it's going to come, as we've seen in London. If you put a bus every 10 minutes past the bus stop, then people will use it. If you push that back to half an hour, then fewer people will use it. So there are some big challenges, but if we're going to make that switch away towards public transport at a local level. But I think many city mayors, of course, have made it, and combined authorities particularly have said that this is what they want to do. We need to give them the opportunity to do it. When it comes to the different ways in which we pay for the electricity going into an electric vehicle, it's not something I would claim to be an expert on, but clearly it is going to flow at the end of the day from a sort of regulatory structure, which government is inevitably going to have to influence, because regulators at the end of the day, I would argue, are there to sort of fulfill broad government policy. So government's got to have some idea about how it sees fairness being achieved in these areas, and the way in which that is reflected in the charge. I mean, I suppose at the end of the day, we might say, well, the more convenient it is and the faster it is, then the more we might expect to pay for it. So you're going to put, charge your car in 5 minutes, you might expect to pay more for that electricity than you would if you're going to take it a charge overnight.
I just add on that, Mark. I think this is why making sure we have comprehensive on-street parking alongside rapid charging is really quite important, because the former should be both more convenient and cheaper and more efficient in terms of demand and supply on the grid. I think it's really important on that on-street parking, on-street charging, that we get competition into those local markets again to potentially help deal with the pricing problem. My slight concern is that we may just drift into sort of localized monopolies in some areas if there isn't some more careful thought about how we're going to design the rollout of on-street charging networks in different local areas. And hopefully, when the government publishes its forthcoming strategy on electric charging infrastructure, we'll start to see some of these problems aired and hopefully some solutions proposed. We'll go to Sharon Darcy next.
Thanks very much. My question's about the cost of living crisis. Clearly, this was a problem before the invasion of Ukraine, and we're seeing energy prices going up with the price cap in April. But the forecast energy increases for October are really, really going to cause a lot of people to suffer. And we're also going to see the impacts of the Ukraine crisis on food prices. And we know that those impact people on the lowest incomes most of all. So my question really is, how do you think the cost of living crisis is going to shape the government's response to your conclusions? And how do you think we should better prioritise infrastructure, given the real cost of living constraints that many families are facing? Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Well, I suppose the first thing I might say as a defence is I don't really want to get into taxation policy because it's not something which we're expected to have a view on. I mean, clearly in the short term, we're all going to adjust our expenditure profiles to what for us is important, and for many people, and sadly for a proportion of society, there are these really hard choices to be made. Can I afford to keep the house warm? How much do I balance on food? How much do I balance on my energy bill? And we can, it's not our role to tell government how it should deal with that, but clearly it's something which the Chancellor and government will be acutely aware of and are going to have to balance in a political sense, because these are political questions, how much support they are able to give and in what form that support takes place. They will have to balance that within their overall, the Chancellor will have to balance that in his overall public expenditure profile, and that, clearly down the road or, in the short term, that might mean that, a bit less is allocated to infrastructure expenditure. Those are the sort of hard choices which have to be made. They are very political choices, and clearly the short term is always going to be one which is foremost in any politician's mind, and the need to deal with that. But as we, our focus is on the long term, and as we've said more than one occasion today, one way in which we can all be helped in the future is by having lower energy use, and we'll have lower energy use the more efficient our homes are, and therefore any support for helping people to reduce their energy consumption has to be, I think, something which is seriously considered. There'll be different ways in which the government might think about how it does that.
Yeah, I just add, Sharon, on the long term, it seems to me that sort of net zero, energy security, affordability, all point largely in the same direction in terms of accelerating the move to a highly renewable system, getting new types of flexibility into the system, and reducing our reliance on gas. So I think sort of medium long term, the sort of doubling down on that strategy is clear. But the short term, these affordability questions are ones that government will clearly have to take a view on, but they're not for the National Infrastructure Commission. I will call Deborah Hall, I think, as our final question. Yes, quite faint, Deborah.
That's better, I think.
Yeah, that's better, yeah.
alongside the climate emergency, we're facing a nature emergency, and we should be striving for low carbon, high nature infrastructure development. How can the NIC in the next infrastructure assessment get this on a firm footing?
Thank you, Deborah. Well, it's something which has sort of increased in, if you like, in its importance in our brief. And I mean, the Chancellor last autumn enhanced our formal remit to include the explicit goal of supporting climate resilience and the transformation to net zero carbon emissions, but also wrote into our framework that we consider the effective implementation of biodiversity net gain whenever we develop policy recommendations. So we are going to be looking in our next national infrastructure assessment at on how any recommendations that we make impact on natural capital, and how natural capital can actually be utilised in a principal terms to do that. So I think you can see from public opinion that this is an issue which is becoming more and more in people's minds. It's one which, as a commission, we recognise the importance of, and there are clearly always techniques where, in fact, you can use natural capital. I mean, a simple one is in flood resilience, of course, and looking upstream rather than downstream at your protection, and looking at how you can actually influence the runoff and the rate of runoff of water. We have natural biodiverse corridors along all of our roads, our railways, canals, and so on. Those are areas which can help to generate more biodiversity, but need to be thought through and carefully managed, and therefore the people in control of those need to be encouraged by government or by regulation to ensure that they are considering how best they can improve the biodiversity corridors. And indeed, of course, we know that with such schemes and things like this, we can improve, we can have a different, more natural capital way of dealing with waste and runoff. And of course, recently we've seen the discussions about just simple things like people deciding, well, it'd be much nicer if my drive was blocked over or paved over. Well, yeah, it might be nice, but actually it doesn't do anything for flood resilience. It doesn't do anything in a broader biodiversity sense. So I think just helping the public to understand the alternatives that are out there is, again, is it central government? Is it local government? But one way or another, we need to make sure that the ways in which we can all help as citizens to ensure that we're doing our bits in these areas, I think is important. James, do you want to?
No, John, I think it's an area, Deborah, that we will, in the second national impact assessment, there'll be a number of areas that play to this theme. We'll be looking at how to reduce the impacts on air pollution from sort of transport and energy. We'll be looking at reducing sort of pollution from sort of wastewater. We're looking at the role of nature-based solutions in terms of dealing with surface water flooding as well in the study we're doing for the Treasury. So I think this theme will be quite prominent in all our work for sort of NIA2. Okay, we have come to 2 minutes past 1, and there are no more hands, which is a good coincidence. So we can now say thank you very much. If John, you want to say any final words before I let people go?
No, well, thank you all very much for attending today and showing the amount of interest that's been shown. We've had a terrific attendance today, which I think just shows how important infrastructure, and of course it's been highlighted. Sadly, the whole issue of energy has been brought to the fore in the last couple of weeks. So we will continue to consult. We'll continue to hopefully engage with you as we produce NIA2 over the next 18 months. And thank you all for your support, for your interest, and for the encouragement that you give us for the work that we do. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Thanks.